Almost immediately after Henry VIII laid eyes on a portrait of the enigmatic Anne of Cleves, he decided she would be his bride. But when they finally met in person, his stomach sank. She was, by his own cruel admission, unthinkably ugly. Anne of Cleves has since become infamous as Henry's rejected queen. Yet modern historians hint at a far more disturbing reason behind his revulsion. Anne of Cleves came from a stubborn stock. Her father, John, Duke of Cleves, was a notorious figure in the Protestant Reformation, defying the Pope and Catholic monarchs at every turn. He raised Anne, her sisters, and brother to think independently, to question authority. Ever since his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry himself despised Catholicism and the Pope. So when Anne of Cleves came of age, his eye landed on her. But Henry didn't get the warm welcome he had hoped for. Anne was deeply bonded to her mother, and their female-led household was a sanctuary for the young woman. When Henry first began courting Anne, the matron of the family quietly tried to prevent the match. Henry VIII's lechery was infamous in his day, but few understand just how grim it was for poor Anne of Cleves. At 24, she was relatively mature for a royal bride, but Henry was nearly twice her age. And he didn't just court Anne, he also considered her younger sister, Amalia, as a potential wife. Had he chosen Amalia, perhaps the disaster of his fourth marriage might have been avoided. In the late 1530s, Henry sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, on a disturbing mission. Still undecided between the sisters, Henry instructed him to paint both Anne and Amalia, so he could pick the one he preferred. His orders were explicit: paint them accurately, no flattery. He needed a beautiful queen, nothing less. But when Holbein arrived, he faced a challenge. Anne and Amalia, following strict German modesty customs, kept their faces hidden behind veils. Gaining their trust was no easy task. He had to gently coax them before they finally revealed their faces and allowed him to paint them. When Holbein returned with the portraits, Henry chose Anne over Amalia. Yet his motives were far from romantic. Historians now agree the decision had less to do with looks and more because Anne of Cleves, as the elder daughter, held greater hereditary rights. Henry's strict, no flattering instruction to Holbein contradicts the popular myth that the painter deceived the king with an embellished portrait of the plain Anne. But as anyone who's seen the portraits can tell you, a painting can't capture everything, especially not chemistry. And when Anne walked into the room to meet Henry, the harsh truth became clear. Henry was deeply displeased. Almost immediately, he complained about her appearance, blaming not only Holbein for flattering her, but also his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, who had urged the match and praised Anne's beauty. Henry's infamous reaction after seeing Anne in person has echoed through history. She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported. Yet despite Henry's cruel disappointment, the royal wedding was already planned. There was no turning back. Once married, the dreaded wedding night loomed, a moment Anne hoped might change Henry's mind. But it went horribly. The morning after, Henry reportedly lamented, "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." It wasn't just Anne of Cleves's inexperience that troubled him. Henry preferred his wives innocent and pliable, but he accused Anne of far worse. He claimed that, besides his lack of attraction, she emitted a foul smell at the worst possible moments, an insult as deeply personal as it was humiliating. After their disappointing meeting and disastrous wedding night, Henry was desperate to rid himself of Anne. What followed was a cold and calculated plot, one born not of love, but of rejection and dread. In 1527, Anne of Cleves was just 11 years old when she was briefly betrothed to Francis of Lorraine. It was a childhood agreement, harmless enough at the time. But over a decade later, Henry VIII and his advisors tried to use that long-forgotten pre-contract to wriggle their king out of a marriage he already regretted. What followed was a spectacle, a full-blown trial to annul the marriage, complete with drama, shame, and farce. Henry's argument: that the union had never been consummated. But here's where it got bizarre. The king didn't want people thinking he was impotent, so he actually hired a doctor to testify on his behalf. The royal physician declared that Henry had experienced not one, but two nocturnal emissions, wet dreams, while sleeping beside Anne for several nights without ever consummating the marriage. Talk about royal oversharing. But let's be clear. Anne wasn't some naive girl blindly walking into this mess. She'd been raised in a household that valued independent thought. Her father, after all, was a prominent figure in the Protestant Reformation. While Henry had long rejected Catholicism, Anne's world was a careful mix of old beliefs and emerging reformist ideas. She knew how to stand her ground. Still, Henry got what he wanted. On July 9, 1540, after just 6 months of marriage, the union was officially annulled. It was the shortest of Henry's many marriages, and Anne had the good fortune to leave it with her head still attached. But the story didn't end there. Even before the annulment was finalized, Henry had already begun casting his eye elsewhere. Convinced that Anne was not the one, he quickly set his sights on the youthful Catherine Howard and married her within weeks of splitting from Anne. Publicly, Anne didn't let it show if she was hurt. She kept up appearances. For New Year's in 1541, she even gifted Henry and his new queen fine horses and joined them for dancing. Graceful, strategic, but trouble was never far. Later that same year, a dark rumor crept through the castle halls. Whispers said Anne had secretly given birth to a child, and some even claimed the father was none other than Henry VIII himself. It was almost certainly false, but the gossip was enough to spark a royal investigation. 2 people were even detained for suggesting Anne and Henry had, in fact, consummated their marriage. By 1542, Anne was back on Henry's radar for all the wrong reasons. His young queen, Catherine Howard, had been accused of adultery and was awaiting execution. The axe that had fallen on Anne Boleyn now loomed over another Catherine. Henry, ever the wounded tyrant, lashed out again. Anne, ever the dutiful ex-wife, received a sharp letter from the king. In it, he demanded she return a royal ring that Catherine Howard had once gifted her. The cruelty of it didn't go unnoticed. And yet, in the shadows of Catherine's downfall, Anne may have nurtured a quiet hope. With Catherine gone, perhaps Henry would come back to her. She had been loyal, kind, and cooperative. Maybe she could now be more than just a former queen. Maybe, just maybe, she could be queen once again. But Henry had other plans. He married Catherine Parr instead. Anne of Cleves wasn't the most educated woman at court, but she was clever. She picked up English rapidly after arriving in England. Still, one thing stood out. Her upbringing hadn't included any of the arts that Henry adored. No music, no singing, no dancing. Even if they could speak to each other in English, they had very little in common. But Anne knew how to play the long game. She built strong relationships with Henry's children. She sent gifts to the young Prince Edward, stayed close to Princess Mary, and left jewelry to Princess Elizabeth when she died. Anne understood exactly where power flowed, and she followed it with care. Her loyalty paid off. After Henry's death, she enjoyed a favorable position under Queen Mary, and likely even attended her coronation. Her final years were quiet, comfortable, exactly what a former queen could hope for in a time when falling out of favor could mean death. It helped that Henry had been surprisingly generous in their divorce. Anne received lands, manors, a royal income, and a prominent title. She was granted precedence over every lady in England, except the king's own wife and daughters. Of course, no amount of titles or income could erase the humiliation Anne endured at the start of her royal journey, but compared to Henry's other wives, Anne walked away not just alive, but empowered. So what about the infamous insult that made her a historical punchline? What did the so-called ugly queen actually look like? In truth, Anne was probably attractive enough by the standards of her time. She was tall, had pretty blonde hair, and a solemn expression that may have aged her beyond her years. Not a beauty, perhaps, but far from the monster Henry made her out to be. She survived him. She outlived the chaos, and she did it all without ever losing her head. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell, the man who arranged the marriage, wasn't so lucky. He was executed for treason on the very same day Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. If Henry disliked Anne so much, then why didn't he just pull the plug before it was too late? He was the King of England, the most powerful man in the land. Surely, if he snapped his fingers, the wedding would have been called off in a heartbeat. But no, because this wasn't just about romance. Anne and Henry were a political match, the kind you can't just walk away from without stirring an international mess. Backing out would have risked offending his German allies at a time when those alliances were crucial, so he went through with it. And while most of Henry's wives met tragic fates, Anne of Cleves outlived them all. She even outlived Henry himself. On July 16, 1557, just shy of her 42nd birthday, Anne died in England, the country she had come to call home. The cause? Most likely cancer. But even in death, Anne was honored. Queen Mary Thurne's court paid tribute to her as their beloved aunt. And while her final resting place wasn't in a grand spot, it was legendary, Westminster Abbey. And here's where Anne pulled off one final power move. Despite the annulment, her grave proudly reads, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England. She's also the only one of Henry's wives to be buried at Westminster Abbey. That's saying something. But let's rewind for a second to her very first meeting with Henry, and oh boy, it did not go as planned. Anne was on her way to London when her party stopped in Rochester on New Year's Day, 1540. She took a moment to watch some bull baiting from the window, when suddenly a large stranger burst into the room. Except, it wasn't just any stranger. It was Henry VIII himself, dressed in disguise. See, Henry had this weird idea that he'd surprise her, sneak in, and witness their love spark instantly. Maybe even have her recognize him through some magical pull of destiny. Romantic in theory, but in practice, a disaster. Accounts differ, but either Anne politely ignored this strange man trying to get her attention, or, even worse, he tried to kiss and grope her, prompting her to raise the alarm about some random guy creeping on her. Either way, not a great start. Henry left that encounter feeling humiliated and furious, and it might have sealed Anne's fate right then and there. Some historians believe that moment planted a seed in Henry's mind, that she wasn't interested in him, even when he tried to be playful or romantic. So from that point forward, he decided not to be interested in her either. And the rest, as they say, is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's wildest stories.